Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of history's most uncomfortable truths. The fact that some of the most powerful men in medieval Europe were absolutely terrible fathers whose failures in the most basic human relationship would shape the destiny of entire nations. Picture yourself in the cold stone halls of a medieval castle, where the cries of children echo not with laughter but with fear, where royal fathers see their sons not as beloved children, but as political assets to be manipulated or obstacles to be removed. These weren't just personal family dramas playing out behind closed doors. These were failures of fatherhood that would trigger wars, topple dynasties, and leave scars on entire civilizations that lasted for centuries. But here's what makes this story even more disturbing. These weren't absent fathers who simply neglected their children. These were men who actively destroyed their own sons and daughters through cruelty, manipulation, and in some cases, outright murder. They turned the sacred bond between parent and child into a weapon of political control. So, before we descend into these dark family histories, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. As darkness settles around you tonight, let me transport you back to medieval England, where King John Lackland earned his infamous nickname not just through military failures, but through his spectacular incompetence as a father. This was a man who inherited one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe and managed to lose most of it while simultaneously destroying the lives of his own children. King John's approach to fatherhood was characterized by the same selfishness and short-sighted thinking that marked his entire reign. When his son Henry was just 9 years old, John was already using the boy as a political pawn, dragging him from battlefield to battlefield during the Civil War that would eventually force John to sign the Magna Carta. The young prince witnessed his father's humiliations, his military defeats, and his desperate attempts to cling to power through increasingly brutal methods. But John's failures went far beyond simply exposing his children to the harsh realities of medieval politics. He actively undermined their emotional development and sense of security through his erratic behavior and violent temper. Court chroniclers describe scenes where John would fly into rages at his children over minor infractions, screaming at them in front of the entire court, and threatening them with punishments that would have been considered excessive even by medieval standards. These public humiliations taught his children that love was conditional and that their father's approval could be withdrawn at any moment. The financial legacy that John left his children was equally devastating. Through his disastrous military campaigns and his habit of alienating his most important nobles, John had bankrupted the English crown and left his heir with debts that would take decades to repay. When 9-year-old Henry III inherited the throne after John's death in 1216, he found himself ruling a kingdom that was effectively controlled by a council of regents because his father had left the monarchy so weakened that a child could not possibly manage it alone. Perhaps most damaging of all was the political chaos that John's failures created for his children. The civil war that forced John to sign the Magna Carta continued to rage after his death. with young Henry III caught in the middle of conflicts that his father had started but failed to resolve. The boy king spent his childhood watching his kingdom tear itself apart, while foreign armies invaded English soil, all because his father had been too proud and too incompetent to govern effectively. The psychological impact of John's parenting style can be seen in the way Henry III ruled when he finally came of age. The young king displayed many of the same character flaws that had destroyed his father. He was indecisive, prone to favoritism, and unable to maintain the loyalty of his nobles. Henry's reign was marked by constant rebellions and civil unrest, suggesting that he had never learned the lessons of effective leadership because his father had been such a poor role model. John's treatment of his daughters was equally problematic, though it followed different patterns than his relationship with his sons. He viewed his daughters purely as diplomatic assets, arranging marriages for them based solely on political advantage without any consideration for their personal happiness or compatibility with their future husbands. These marriages were often to much older men in foreign countries, effectively exiling his daughters from England and ensuring that they would have little influence over their own lives. The contrast between John's public image and his private behavior as a father reveals the complex relationship between political power and personal character in medieval society. While John could command armies and negotiate with foreign kings, he was completely unable to provide the emotional stability and guidance that his children needed. His failures as a father were not separate from his failures as a king. They were different manifestations of the same fundamental character flaws. The long-term consequences of John's poor fathering extended far beyond his immediate family. The weakness and instability that characterized Henry III's early reign created opportunities for ambitious nobles to increase their own power at the expense of royal authority. This shift in the balance of power between the crown and the nobility would have lasting effects on English political development, ultimately contributing to the constitutional crises that would plague England for centuries. The religious and moral dimensions of John's failures as a father were particularly shocking to his contemporaries. Medieval Christian theology placed enormous emphasis on the father's role as the head of the household and the primary moral guide for his children. By failing so spectacularly in this role, John was not just damaging his own family but violating one of the most fundamental expectations of Christian kingship. His inability to govern his own household raised serious questions about his fitness to govern the kingdom. The educational neglect that characterized John's approach to child rearing had serious consequences for the next generation of English leadership. While other medieval kings invested heavily in their children's education, hiring the best tutors and ensuring that their heirs were prepared for the responsibilities of rule, John showed little interest in his children's intellectual development. This neglect left Henry III poorly prepared for the complex challenges of medieval kingship and contributed to many of the mistakes that would define his reign. As you settle deeper into your pillow tonight, consider how the failures of one man's fatherhood could echo through generations and shape the destiny of an entire nation. King John's story reminds us that the most powerful positions in society come with responsibilities that extend far beyond public duties to include the most fundamental human relationships. His legacy serves as a warning about what happens when personal character flaws are magnified by absolute power and the absence of accountability. The story of Ivan the Terrible's relationship with his son represents perhaps the most shocking example of paternal failure in all of medieval history. A tale so horrifying that it challenges our understanding of how a father could destroy the very future he had spent decades building. What makes Ivan's story particularly disturbing is not just that he killed his own son, but the calculated cruelty and psychological torture that preceded that final, fatal blow. Ivan IV of Russia, known to history as Ivan the Terrible, was a man whose paranoia and violence knew no bounds. But his treatment of his eldest son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, revealed depths of cruelty that shocked even his violence-hardened contemporaries. The relationship between father and son had been deteriorating for years, poisoned by Ivan's increasing mental instability and his obsessive need to control every aspect of his heir's life. What began as typical royal father-son tensions escalated into a psychological war that would end in the most unthinkable tragedy. The young Ivan Ivanovich was everything his father should have wanted in an heir: intelligent, capable, and genuinely concerned about the welfare of the Russian people. But these very qualities became sources of conflict as the prince began to question his father's increasingly brutal policies and erratic behavior. The son's attempts to moderate his father's excesses were interpreted by Ivan the Terrible not as wisdom but as betrayal, evidence that his own child was plotting against him. The psychological abuse that Ivan inflicted on his son was systematic and devastating. He would summon the prince to court for what appeared to be normal father-son meetings, only to subject him to hours of screaming accusations and threats. Ivan accused his son of everything from military incompetence to treasonous correspondence with foreign enemies, often based on nothing more than his own paranoid fantasies. These sessions would leave the young prince emotionally shattered and increasingly desperate to prove his loyalty to a father who seemed determined to find fault with everything he did. The final confrontation that led to the prince's death began over what should have been a minor family matter: Ivan Ivanovich's choice of wife. The prince had married 3 times, with each marriage ending in tragedy due to his father's interference. When Ivan the Terrible disapproved of his son's 3rd wife's clothing at a court function, the argument that followed revealed years of accumulated resentment and fear. The prince finally found the courage to confront his father about the damage his policies were doing to Russia, particularly the devastating war in Livonia that was bleeding the country dry. What happened next was witnessed by several courtiers and recorded in horrifying detail. Ivan the Terrible flew into one of his characteristic rages, but this time his fury was directed at the one person who should have been safe from his violence. He began beating his son with his iron-pointed staff, striking him repeatedly about the head and body, while screaming that he was a traitor who deserved to die. The prince tried to defend himself, pleading with his father to listen to reason, but Ivan was beyond rational thought. The fatal blow came when Ivan struck his son in the temple with the pointed end of his staff. The prince collapsed immediately, blood pouring from the wound, and it became clear that the injury was mortal. In that moment, Ivan the Terrible's rage transformed into horror as he realized what he had done. The man who had shown no mercy to thousands of victims suddenly became a grief-stricken father, cradling his dying son and begging for forgiveness that would never come in. The 3 days that Ivan Ivanovich took to die were perhaps the most psychologically devastating period of Ivan the Terrible's life. The Tsar refused to leave his son's bedside, alternating between desperate prayers for divine intervention and frantic attempts to treat the wound himself. He brought in every physician and holy man in Moscow, offering them anything if they could save his son's life. But the damage was too severe, and on the 19th of November, 1581, the prince died in agony, while his father watched helplessly. The immediate aftermath of the prince's death revealed the full magnitude of Ivan's failure as both a father and a ruler. With his capable heir dead, the succession fell to his second son, Fyodor, who was mentally disabled and completely unfit to rule. Ivan had not only murdered his own child, but had effectively destroyed the future of the Rurik dynasty that had ruled Russia for over 700 years. The political chaos that followed Ivan's own death in 1584 was a direct result of this moment of paternal madness. The psychological impact of the filicide on Ivan himself was profound and lasting. Witnesses described how the Tsar aged dramatically in the months following his son's death, his hair turning white and his body becoming frail. He was haunted by nightmares and would often be found wandering the palace at night, calling out his dead son's name. The man who had terrorized an entire nation was now terrorized by his own guilt and the knowledge that he had committed the ultimate sin against both God and nature. The religious implications of Ivan's crime were enormous in the context of Orthodox Christian society. The killing of one's own child was considered one of the most heinous sins possible, a violation of both divine and natural law that placed the perpetrator beyond the possibility of redemption. Ivan's desperate attempts to atone for his crime through increasingly extreme religious observances only highlighted the magnitude of what he had done. He donated vast sums to monasteries, commissioned prayers for his son's soul, and even considered abdicating to become a monk. But nothing could ease his torment. The political consequences of Ivan's filicide extended far beyond the immediate succession crisis. The death of Ivan Ivanovich removed the one person who might have been able to moderate his father's policies and restore stability to Russia. The prince had been popular with both the nobility and the common people, and his death eliminated the possibility of a smooth transition to more rational governance. Instead, Russia was left with a mentally incompetent heir and a guilt-ridden tyrant whose remaining years would be marked by even greater instability and violence. The international reaction to news of the prince's death was one of shock and horror. Foreign diplomats struggled to understand how a ruler could destroy his own succession in a moment of rage. The incident reinforced Russia's reputation as a barbaric and unpredictable nation, complicating diplomatic relations and contributing to the country's isolation from Western Europe. The image of Ivan the Terrible as a mad tyrant was cemented by this act of ultimate paternal failure. The artistic and cultural legacy of this tragedy has endured for centuries. The famous painting by Ilya Repin depicting Ivan cradling his dying son captures the horror and remorse of that moment. While countless literary works have explored the psychological dimensions of a father's ultimate betrayal of his child, the story has become a symbol of how absolute power can corrupt even the most fundamental human relationships. The medical evidence surrounding the prince's death provides chilling details about the nature of his injuries. Modern forensic analysis of Ivan Ivanovich's remains has confirmed that he died from a severe head trauma consistent with being struck by a pointed weapon. The location and severity of the wound suggest that death was not immediate, but would have been inevitable, meaning that both father and son had to live with the knowledge of what was coming during those final 3 days. As you drift towards sleep tonight, consider the terrible weight of a moment's uncontrolled rage and how it can destroy not just individual lives, but the future of entire nations. Ivan the Terrible's story serves as the ultimate warning about the consequences of allowing anger and paranoia to overcome the most basic human instincts of protection and love. His tragedy reminds us that no amount of power or authority can undo the damage caused by a single act of irreversible violence against those we should cherish most. While Ivan the Terrible's filicide represents the ultimate extreme of paternal failure, other medieval fathers found ways to destroy their children's lives through methods that were perhaps even more psychologically devastating. The slow, methodical erosion of their sons' and daughters' dignity, confidence, and humanity through years of calculated cruelty and public humiliation. These fathers understood that there were ways to kill a child's spirit that were far more sophisticated than simple physical violence. Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair, demonstrated how a father's cold, calculating nature could transform family relationships into instruments of political control and personal revenge. Philip's approach to fatherhood was characterized by an emotional detachment so complete that his own children became nothing more than chess pieces in his elaborate games of power. He viewed his sons and daughters not as human beings deserving of love and guidance, but as assets to be deployed, manipulated, and, if necessary, sacrificed for his political ambitions. The most notorious example of Philip's paternal cruelty emerged during the scandal involving his 3 daughters-in-law, known to history as the Tour de Nesle affair. When Philip discovered that 2 of his daughters-in-law were having extramarital affairs, while the third was allegedly aware of the adultery, his response revealed the depths of his capacity for familial destruction. Rather than handling the matter with discretion to protect his family's reputation, Philip chose to make it a public spectacle that would humiliate not just the guilty parties but his own sons as well. Philip's handling of the scandal was deliberately designed to maximize the psychological damage to his children. He forced his sons to participate in the investigation and trial of their own wives, requiring them to testify about intimate details of their marriages in open court. The future kings of France were compelled to publicly acknowledge their wives' infidelities and their own failures as husbands, a humiliation that would have been devastating for any man, but was particularly cruel for princes whose authority depended on respect and dignity. The punishments that Philip imposed on his daughters-in-law were savage even by medieval standards. 2 of the women were imprisoned for life, with their heads shaved and forced to wear rough sackcloth as they rotted in cold, damp cells. The third, who is merely suspected of knowledge about the affairs, was also imprisoned, but later released. Philip ensured that his sons understood that this was the fate that awaited anyone who betrayed the royal family, even their own wives. The message was clear. Loyalty to Philip superseded all other relationships, including marriage. The psychological impact of this scandal on Philip's sons was profound and lasting. His eldest son, Louis X, became increasingly paranoid and suspicious, unable to trust anyone completely. After witnessing how his father had destroyed his marriage, Philip IV, the second son, developed a reputation for cruelty that may have been learned from watching his father's methods. Charles IV, the youngest, became withdrawn and melancholy, never fully recovering from the trauma of seeing his family torn apart by his father's machinations. Edward I of England, known as Longshanks, employed different but equally devastating methods to destroy his son's confidence and authority. Edward's relationship with his heir, the future Edward II, was characterized by public contempt and deliberate humiliation that began in the prince's childhood and continued until Edward I's death. The king made no effort to hide his disappointment in his son, frequently criticizing the prince in front of courtiers, foreign dignitaries, and even common soldiers. Edward I's public humiliation of his son was systematic and relentless. He would openly mock the prince's interests in music, poetry, and crafts, declaring that these were unworthy pursuits for a future king who should be focused solely on warfare and conquest. When the prince showed kindness to servants or mercy to enemies, Edward I would publicly berate him for weakness, often in language so harsh that witnesses were shocked. The king seemed to take pleasure in undermining his son's authority and making him appear foolish in front of others. The most devastating aspect of Edward I's treatment of his son was his deliberate sabotage of the prince's relationships with the nobility. Whenever young Edward tried to build alliances or friendships with important lords, his father would intervene to undermine these relationships. Edward I would spread rumors about his son's incompetence, question his judgment in front of potential allies, and even go so far as to countermand the prince's orders in public. This systematic destruction of his son's political network ensured that Edward II would inherit a throne without the support structure necessary for effective rule. The long-term consequences of Edward I's psychological abuse became apparent during Edward II's disastrous reign. The prince, who had been constantly told he was weak and incompetent, grew up to become a king who was indeed weak and incompetent, fulfilling his father's prophecies in a tragic example of self-fulfilling destruction. Edward II's inability to command respect from his nobles, his poor military judgment, and his eventual deposition and murder can all be traced back to the psychological damage inflicted by his father's relentless criticism. The methods that these medieval fathers used to control and destroy their children were often more sophisticated than simple physical abuse. They understood that breaking a child's spirit was more effective than breaking their body, and they developed techniques for psychological manipulation that would be recognized today as forms of emotional abuse. These fathers used shame, humiliation, and the withdrawal of love as weapons to shape their children's behavior and ensure their compliance. The religious and moral justifications that these fathers provided for their cruelty reveal the complex relationship between paternal authority and spiritual duty in medieval society. Both Philip IV and Edward I claimed that their harsh treatment of their children was necessary to prepare them for the responsibilities of kingship. They argued that royal children needed to be toughened through adversity, and that showing them too much affection would make them weak and unfit to rule. These rationalizations allowed them to continue their abuse while maintaining their reputations as devout Christians and responsible fathers. The impact of these paternal failures extended far beyond the immediate families involved. The psychological damage inflicted on royal heirs had serious consequences for the kingdoms they would eventually rule. Rulers who had been systematically undermined and humiliated by their fathers often proved incapable of providing the strong leadership that their nations needed. The political instability that resulted from these failures of fatherhood contributed to wars, rebellions, and dynastic crises that affected millions of people. The contrast between these fathers' public images and their private behavior reveals the complex relationship between political success and personal character. Both Philip IV and Edward I were considered successful kings who expanded their kingdom's power and influence. Yet their failures as fathers ultimately undermined their political achievements by ensuring that their successors would be unable to maintain what they had built. Their stories demonstrate that true leadership requires not just the ability to command armies and negotiate treaties, but also the wisdom to nurture and guide the next generation. As you settle deeper into sleep tonight, consider how the wounds inflicted by cruel parents can echo through generations, shaping not just individual lives, but the destiny of entire civilizations. The medieval fathers we have studied tonight remind us that the most powerful people in society have the greatest capacity for both good and evil, and that their failures in the most basic human relationships can have consequences that extend far beyond their own families. Their stories serve as warnings about the terrible responsibility that comes with power over others, especially those who are most vulnerable and dependent on our love and guidance. The legacy of these terrible medieval fathers extends far beyond their own lifetimes, creating ripple effects that shape the political, social, and cultural development of entire civilizations for centuries to come. What makes their failures particularly tragic is not just the personal suffering they inflicted on their children, but the way their paternal incompetence undermined the very institutions and traditions they were supposed to protect and strengthen. The dynastic consequences of failed fatherhood were perhaps the most immediately visible and devastating. When King John's poor parenting left Henry III emotionally damaged and politically unprepared, it set in motion a series of events that would fundamentally alter the relationship between the English crown and its nobility. Henry's weak rule invited challenges from ambitious barons who might never have dared to confront a more confident and capable king. The constitutional crises that plagued England throughout the 13th century can be traced directly back to John's failures as both a king and a father. The psychological patterns established by these abusive fathers were often perpetuated by their damaged children, creating cycles of dysfunction that could persist for generations. Edward II, having been systematically humiliated by his father Edward I, proved incapable of providing strong leadership for his own son, the future Edward III. While Edward III eventually became one of England's most successful medieval kings, his early years were marked by the same kind of political instability and family dysfunction that had characterized his father's reign. The trauma of witnessing his father's deposition and murder left psychological scars that influenced Edward III's own approach to kingship and family relationships. The impact of Ivan the Terrible's filicide on Russian political development was catastrophic and long-lasting. With his capable heir dead and only the mentally disabled Feodor left to inherit the throne, Ivan had effectively ended the Rurik dynasty that had ruled Russia for over 7 centuries. The succession crisis that followed Ivan's death in 1584 plunged Russia into the time of troubles, a period of civil war, foreign invasion, and social chaos that lasted for over 2 decades. The political instability that resulted from Ivan's moment of paternal madness created opportunities for ambitious nobles and foreign powers to exploit Russian weakness. The religious and moral authority of medieval kingship was severely undermined by these examples of paternal failure. Medieval political theory held that kings derived their authority from God and were expected to serve as moral exemplars for their subjects. When rulers proved incapable of fulfilling the most basic responsibilities of fatherhood, it raised serious questions about their fitness to govern others. The scandals and tragedies that surrounded these royal families damaged the mystique of kingship and contributed to the gradual erosion of absolute royal authority. The cultural impact of these stories extended far beyond the immediate political consequences. The tales of royal fathers who destroyed their own children became cautionary legends that influenced literature, art, and popular culture for centuries. The story of Ivan the Terrible killing his son inspired countless artistic works that explored themes of power, madness, and the corruption of paternal love. These stories served as warnings about the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of maintaining human connections, even in positions of great power. The legal and constitutional developments that emerged in response to these failures of royal fatherhood had lasting impacts on the evolution of government. The weakness displayed by damaged royal heirs created opportunities for nobles and parliamentary institutions to assert greater control over royal decision-making. The English Magna Carta, signed by King John under pressure from his barons, established precedents for limiting royal authority that would eventually evolve into modern constitutional monarchy. Similar developments in other kingdoms showed how paternal failures could inadvertently contribute to political progress. The economic consequences of these dynastic disruptions were enormous and affected millions of ordinary people. Civil wars, succession crises, and political instability disrupted trade, destroyed agricultural productivity, and diverted resources from productive activities to military conflicts. The time of troubles in Russia, triggered by Ivan's filicide, resulted in massive population losses, economic collapse, and the destruction of entire regions. The human cost of these paternal failures extended far beyond the royal families themselves to encompass entire populations who suffered from the political chaos that resulted. The international implications of these domestic failures were equally significant. Weak or unstable kingdoms became targets for foreign aggression and lost their ability to project power beyond their borders. England's internal conflicts during Henry III's reign allowed France to reclaim territories that had been conquered by earlier English kings. Russia's weakness during the time of troubles invited invasions from Poland and Sweden that might have been impossible if Ivan had not destroyed his own succession. These examples demonstrate how personal failures at the highest levels of government could have geopolitical consequences. The lessons that medieval chroniclers and political theorists drew from these examples of failed fatherhood influenced the development of educational and governmental institutions. The recognition that even the most powerful rulers could fail in their most basic human relationships led to increased emphasis on moral education for royal heirs and the development of systems of advisors and regents to provide guidance and oversight. Some kingdoms began to establish more formal processes for evaluating the fitness of potential rulers and for managing succession crises. The psychological insights that emerged from studying these cases of paternal failure were remarkably advanced for their time. Medieval observers recognized that the trauma inflicted by cruel fathers could have lasting effects on their children's ability to function as adults and leaders. They understood that emotional abuse could be as damaging as physical violence, and that the psychological wounds inflicted in childhood could influence behavior for decades. These insights contributed to the gradual development of more sophisticated understanding of human psychology and child development. The contrast between these failed fathers and more successful medieval rulers highlights the importance of emotional intelligence and empathy in effective leadership. Kings like Louis IX of France, St. Louis, and Alfred the Great of England, who were known for their devotion to their children and their ability to balance royal duties with family responsibilities, left stronger and more stable kingdoms to their heirs. These positive examples demonstrate that successful leadership requires not just political and military skills, but also the ability to nurture and guide the next generation. As we prepare to leave the dark world of medieval family dysfunction and explore new chapters in human history, remember that the stories we have shared tonight offer timeless lessons about the relationship between personal character and public responsibility. The terrible fathers we have studied remind us that no amount of political power or military success can compensate for failures in our most fundamental human relationships. Their legacy serves as a warning that the greatest leaders are often those who understand that their most important legacy lies not in the kingdoms they build, but in the children they raise. From the cold stone halls where royal children learn to fear their fathers, our journey now takes us to the warm chambers where brilliant minds worked to unlock the secrets of nature itself. We turn from the failures of human relationships to explore one of humanity's greatest successes: the development of scientific knowledge that allowed our ancestors to predict and understand the natural world around them. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let the lessons of these failed fathers remind you of the precious responsibility that comes with influence over others and the importance of using that influence to nurture rather than destroy. From the cold halls where medieval fathers destroyed their children's futures through cruelty and neglect, our journey through history now carries us to one of the most pivotal moments in Western civilization: the assassination of Julius Caesar, a single act of violence that would paradoxically destroy the Roman Republic in order to save it, and in doing so, give birth to an empire that would dominate the world for centuries. While those royal fathers failed through personal weakness, the Roman senators who plotted Caesar's death failed through a fundamental misunderstanding of the forces they were trying to control. The Rome that Caesar inherited was already a republic in crisis, torn apart by civil wars, political corruption, and the inability of traditional institutions to govern an empire that stretched from Britain to Egypt. The old system of government that had worked well for a city-state was completely inadequate for managing the vast territories, diverse populations, and complex economic relationships that Rome now controlled. Caesar's rise to power was not the cause of the Republic's problems, but rather a symptom of deeper structural failures that had been building for generations. Julius Caesar himself was a figure of extraordinary complexity, a brilliant military commander, a skilled politician, a talented writer, and a man whose ambitions seemed to know no bounds. His conquest of Gaul had made him fabulously wealthy and given him the loyalty of battle-hardened legions who would follow him anywhere. But it was his crossing of the Rubicon River in 49 BCE that marked the point of no return in his relationship with the Roman establishment. By bringing his army into Italy, Caesar had violated one of the Republic's most sacred laws and declared war on the very system that had created him. The civil war that followed Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon was not just a conflict between rival generals, but a struggle over the fundamental nature of Roman government. Caesar's enemies, led by Pompey the Great and supported by most of the Senate, represented the traditional republican values of shared power and constitutional government. Caesar, while claiming to fight for the rights of the common people, was clearly seeking to concentrate power in his own hands. The war that ensued would determine whether Rome would remain a republic or become something entirely new. Caesar's victory in the Civil War was swift and decisive, demonstrating both his military genius and the weakness of his opponents. His famous clemency toward defeated enemies was not just a political strategy, but a revolutionary approach to Roman politics. Where previous victors in civil wars had conducted bloody purges of their opponents, Caesar chose to forgive and even promote former enemies. This policy won him many supporters, but also created a dangerous situation where men who had fought against him were now in positions where they could strike back. The reforms that Caesar implemented during his brief period of supreme power revealed both his vision for Rome's future and the reasons why so many senators came to fear him. He reorganized the calendar, reformed the legal system, expanded citizenship to people throughout the empire, and launched massive public works projects that provided employment for Rome's urban poor. These changes were popular with ordinary Romans, but threatened the traditional privileges of the senatorial class. Caesar was not just reforming the government. He was fundamentally altering the social and economic structure of Roman society. The title of Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life, that Caesar accepted in 44 BCE was the final straw for many senators who had been willing to tolerate his reforms as temporary measures. In the Roman system, dictatorship was supposed to be a temporary emergency measure, lasting only as long as needed to deal with a specific crisis. By making himself dictator for life, Caesar was essentially declaring that the crisis would never end and that the republic would never be restored. This was a step too far for men who had grown up believing in the ideals of republican government. The conspiracy that formed against Caesar was not the work of a few ambitious individuals, but represented a broad coalition of senators who genuinely believed they were saving the republic from tyranny. The conspirators included both former enemies like Brutus and Cassius, and former allies who had become disillusioned with Caesar's growing autocracy. They convinced themselves that by killing Caesar, they could restore the traditional system of government and return Rome to its republican roots. Their fundamental miscalculation was in believing that the problems of the republic could be solved by removing a single man. The personal relationships that bound the conspirators to Caesar made their plot particularly tragic. Brutus, whom Caesar had treated almost like a son, struggled with the decision to join the conspiracy, but ultimately convinced himself that his duty to the Republic outweighed his personal loyalty. Cassius, who had served under Caesar in Gaul, felt betrayed by what he saw as Caesar's abandonment of republican principles. These were not men motivated by personal ambition or petty jealousy, but individuals who believed they were making a terrible sacrifice for the greater good. The planning of the assassination required careful coordination and absolute secrecy. The conspirators had to recruit enough senators to ensure success while avoiding detection by Caesar's supporters and bodyguards. They chose the Ides of March, the 15th of March, because the Senate was scheduled to meet that day, providing a perfect opportunity to strike when Caesar would be surrounded by the conspirators but away from his loyal soldiers. The location they selected, the Theater of Pompey, was symbolically appropriate, as it was built by Caesar's former rival and enemy. The warnings that Caesar received about the danger he faced on the Ides of March have become legendary. Soothsayers warned him to beware the day. His wife Calpurnia had prophetic dreams of his death, and friends advised him to stay home. Even a stranger pressed a note into his hand warning him of the plot, though Caesar never read it. These warnings suggest that rumors of the conspiracy were circulating widely, yet Caesar chose to ignore them, perhaps because he had grown overconfident in his own invincibility. As you drift towards sleep tonight, consider the terrible irony of men who destroyed what they were trying to save. The senators who killed Caesar believed they were preserving the Roman Republic, but their actions would instead lead to its final destruction and the establishment of an empire that would last for centuries. Their story reminds us that the most catastrophic failures often come from the best intentions, and that the consequences of our actions can be completely opposite to what we intend. Tomorrow, we will witness the moment when their carefully laid plans collided with the brutal reality of Roman politics. The morning of the 15th of March, 44 BCE, dawned with an atmosphere of tension and foreboding that seemed to hang over Rome like a dark cloud, as if the very gods themselves were holding their breath in anticipation of the violence that was about to unfold. What the conspirators had planned as a swift, surgical strike to save the Republic would instead become one of the most shocking and brutal political assassinations in human history, a moment of such savagery that it would haunt the Roman imagination for generations. The final preparations for the assassination revealed the careful planning and coordination that had gone into the conspiracy. The senators involved had spent weeks rehearsing their roles, determining who would strike first, who would block the exits, and who would deliver the killing blows. They had even practiced their speeches for after the deed was done, preparing to justify their actions to the Roman people and the world. What they had not prepared for was the psychological reality of committing murder, or the chaos that would follow their carefully orchestrated act. Brutus, the most reluctant of the conspirators, spent the night before the assassination in agonized contemplation of what he was about to do. As the descendant of the Brutus who had helped establish the Roman Republic by overthrowing the last king, he felt the weight of history pressing down on him. His wife Portia, sensing his distress, had even injured herself to prove that she could be trusted with his secrets. The personal cost of the conspiracy was already tearing apart the lives of those involved, even before the first blow was struck. Caesar's decision to attend the Senate meeting, despite all the warnings he had received, was influenced by a combination of political necessity and personal pride. He could not afford to appear weak or superstitious by canceling an important Senate session based on dreams and omens. Mark Antony, his most trusted lieutenant, had been deliberately detained by one of the conspirators to ensure that Caesar would arrive at the theater of Pompeii without his most capable bodyguard. This manipulation showed the sophistication of the plot and the conspirators' understanding of the key relationships that protected Caesar. The moment Caesar entered the theater of Pompey, the conspiracy began to unfold with the precision of a military operation. The conspirators had positioned themselves strategically throughout the chamber, creating a human net that would prevent Caesar from escaping once the attack began. Tullius Cimber approached Caesar with a petition for his brother's recall from exile, a request that required Caesar to focus his attention and come close enough for the assassins to strike. When Caesar dismissed the petition, Cimber grabbed his toga and pulled it from his shoulders, the signal for the attack to begin. The first blow was struck by Servilius Casca, who stabbed Caesar in the neck with a dagger. But the wound was not immediately fatal, and Caesar's reaction was not the collapse the conspirators had expected. Instead, the dictator fought back with surprising strength and fury, grabbing Casca's arm and stabbing him with his stylus. For a moment, it seemed as though Caesar might actually fight his way free from the attack, demonstrating the physical courage and combat experience that had made him one of Rome's greatest generals. What followed was not the clean, quick assassination the conspirators had planned, but a frenzied, chaotic melee that shocked even those who were participating in it. As more conspirators joined the attack, they began stabbing not just Caesar but each other, in their desperation to land killing blows. The scene became a nightmare of blood and confusion, with senators slipping on the gore-covered floor and Caesar fighting desperately for his life against overwhelming odds. The dignity and purpose that the conspirators had hoped to maintain dissolved into savage brutality. The moment that broke Caesar's resistance came when he saw Brutus among his attackers, dagger in hand and blood on his toga. According to the historian Suetonius, Caesar's last words were not the famous "Et tu, Brute" of Shakespeare's imagination, but the Greek phrase "Kai su teknon," "You too, my child." This personal betrayal by the young man he had loved like a son seemed to drain all fight from Caesar, and he stopped resisting the attack. The political assassination had become a family tragedy of the most heartbreaking kind. The final moments of Caesar's life were witnessed by dozens of senators who stood frozen in horror as the conspiracy they had supported or tolerated played out before their eyes. Caesar received 23 stab wounds, though only one, a thrust to the chest that pierced his heart, was actually fatal. The irony was not lost on observers that Caesar, who had survived countless battles and defeated enemies across the known world, was killed not by foreign foes, but by his own colleagues in the heart of Rome itself. The immediate aftermath of the assassination revealed how poorly the conspirators had planned for what would happen after Caesar's death. They had assumed that the Roman people would greet news of the dictator's death with celebration and gratitude. welcoming the restoration of Republican government. Instead, the senators who had not participated in the plot fled the chamber in terror, while those who had committed the deed found themselves standing over Caesar's body with no clear plan for what to do next. The power vacuum they had created was already beginning to destabilize the very republic they had tried to save. Brutus attempted to address the remaining senators with a speech about liberty and the restoration of republican values, but his words fell on deaf ears. The men who heard him were not thinking about political theory, but about their own survival in the chaos that was sure to follow. Many senators had been personally loyal to Caesar, while others feared the reaction of Caesar's soldiers and supporters. The conspirators found themselves isolated and increasingly desperate as they realized that their act of liberation was being perceived as an act of treason. The news of Caesar's assassination spread through Rome with lightning speed, carried by slaves, freedmen, and citizens who had witnessed the aftermath. But instead of the celebration the conspirators expected, the news was met with shock, grief, and growing anger. Caesar had been popular with the common people of Rome, who remembered his generosity, his public works projects, and his expansion of citizenship. To them, the senators who had killed him were not liberators but murderers who had destroyed their champion. The conspirators' attempt to present themselves as the saviors of the Republic was undermined by the brutal reality of what they had done. The image of Caesar's blood-soaked body lying at the foot of Pompey's statue created a powerful symbol that his supporters would use to rally opposition to the assassins. The conspirators had succeeded in killing Caesar, but they had failed completely in their goal of restoring republican government. Instead, they had created the conditions for an even more autocratic system to emerge. The psychological impact of the assassination on the conspirators themselves was immediate and devastating. Men who had convinced themselves that they were performing a noble act of tyrannicide found themselves covered in blood and facing the horrified stares of their colleagues. Brutus, in particular, seemed to realize almost immediately that he had made a terrible mistake. The weight of what he had done to his father figure would haunt him for the rest of his short life. As you settle into sleep tonight, consider how a single moment of violence can shatter carefully laid plans and unleash forces that no one can control. The conspirators who killed Caesar believed they were performing a surgical operation on the Roman body politic, but instead, they had inflicted a mortal wound that would prove impossible to heal. Their story reminds us that the most well-intentioned actions can have consequences that are completely opposite to what we intend, and that violence, once unleashed, follows its own terrible logic. Tomorrow, we will see how Caesar's death became the catalyst for events that would transform the ancient world forever. The funeral of Julius Caesar, 3 days after his assassination, became the moment when the conspirators' carefully laid plans completely collapsed, transforming what they had intended as a liberation into the catalyst for an even more autocratic system than the one they had tried to destroy. Mark Antony, Caesar's most loyal lieutenant and a master of political theater, turned the funeral into a weapon that would destroy the assassins more effectively than any army. The conspirators had made a fatal error in allowing Caesar's body to be displayed publicly and permitting Mark Antony to deliver the funeral oration. They believed that once the initial shock of the assassination wore off, the Roman people would come to appreciate their act of tyrannicide. Brutus had even been permitted to speak first at the funeral, delivering a carefully reasoned speech about liberty and the restoration of republican values. But his dry, philosophical arguments were no match for the emotional manipulation that Antony was about to unleash. Mark Antony understood something that the conspirators had completely missed: that politics is as much about emotion as it is about reason, and that the Roman people's love for Caesar was far deeper than the senators had realized. When Antony took the podium to deliver his eulogy, he was not just speaking as Caesar's friend and lieutenant, but as a master politician who knew exactly how to turn grief into rage and sorrow into vengeance. The speech he delivered would become one of the most effective pieces of political rhetoric in human history. Antony began his oration with apparent restraint, praising Caesar's achievements while seeming to respect the conspirators' claims about defending the Republic. He spoke of Caesar's military victories, his generosity to the Roman people, and his refusal of the crown when it was offered to him. But with each example of Caesar's virtue, Antony was building a case that the man the conspirators had killed was not a tyrant, but a benefactor. The crowd began to murmur with growing anger as they realized the magnitude of what had been taken from them. The turning point in Antony's speech came when he produced Caesar's will and began to read its contents to the assembled crowd. Caesar had left generous bequests to every Roman citizen and had donated his private gardens to the city for public use. This revelation that the tyrant had been planning to give away his wealth to the people created a powerful contrast with the senators who had killed him. The crowd's anger began to focus not just on the loss of Caesar, but on the selfishness and ingratitude of his assassins. But Antony's masterstroke came when he displayed Caesar's blood-stained toga to the crowd, pointing out each tear made by the conspirators' daggers. He described how Caesar had tried to cover his face with his toga when he saw Brutus among his attackers, how the man who had conquered Gaul and crossed the Rubicon had died not in battle, but through treachery. The visual impact of the torn and bloody garment, combined with Antony's vivid description of Caesar's final moments, created an emotional response that completely overwhelmed any rational arguments about Republican virtue. The crowd's reaction to Antony's speech was immediate and explosive. What had begun as a solemn funeral became a riot as thousands of Romans poured into the streets demanding vengeance for Caesar's murder. They seized benches, tables, and anything else that would burn to create an impromptu funeral pyre in the Forum, cremating Caesar's body in the heart of the city. The flames that consumed Caesar's remains also symbolically burned away any hope the conspirators had of justifying their actions to the Roman people. The violence that erupted after Antony's speech revealed the depth of popular anger against the conspirators. Mobs roamed the streets looking for anyone associated with the assassination, and several innocent men were killed simply because they shared names with the conspirators. The poet Cinna was literally torn apart by a crowd that confused him with one of the assassins. The conspirators themselves were forced to flee Rome, abandoning their homes and families as they realized that their lives were in immediate danger. The political consequences of Caesar's funeral were even more significant than the immediate violence. Antony had successfully transformed the narrative around Caesar's death from tyrannicide to martyrdom. making it impossible for the conspirators to claim moral authority for their actions. The Roman people now saw Caesar not as a threat to the Republic, but as its greatest champion, killed by jealous and ungrateful senators who had betrayed their benefactor. This shift in public opinion would make it impossible for the conspirators to return to Rome or participate in normal political life. The irony of the situation was not lost on contemporary observers. The conspirators who had killed Caesar to prevent him from becoming a king had instead made him into something far more powerful, a martyr whose memory would be used to justify the very autocracy they had tried to prevent. Caesar's death had not ended the crisis of the Roman Republic, but had accelerated it, creating conditions that would make the restoration of traditional republican government impossible. Mark Antony's manipulation of Caesar's funeral also demonstrated the power of political theater in shaping public opinion. His use of props, timing, and emotional appeals showed a sophisticated understanding of mass psychology that was centuries ahead of its time. The techniques he employed, the gradual building of emotional tension, the strategic revelation of information, the use of visual symbols to reinforce verbal arguments, would be studied and imitated by politicians for thousands of years. The failure of the conspirators to control the narrative after Caesar's death revealed their fundamental misunderstanding of Roman politics and society. They had assumed that killing Caesar would automatically restore republican government, but they had no plan for managing the transition or dealing with Caesar's supporters. Their belief that the Roman people would spontaneously embrace republican values showed how out of touch they were with the realities of popular sentiment. The international reaction to Caesar's assassination and its aftermath was one of shock and concern. Foreign kings and rulers who had dealt with Caesar as the effective leader of Rome now faced uncertainty about who they should negotiate with and what agreements would be honored. The chaos in Rome created opportunities for enemies of the Republic to exploit Roman weakness, while allies began to question whether Rome could be trusted to maintain its commitments. The economic disruption caused by the political crisis was immediate and severe. Trade networks that depended on Roman stability were disrupted, while the uncertainty about the future of the government made long-term planning impossible. The violence in the streets of Rome scared away foreign merchants and investors, while the flight of the conspirators removed many wealthy and influential Romans from economic life. The conspiracy that was supposed to save the Republic was instead destroying its prosperity. The religious and cultural impact of Caesar's transformation from dictator to martyr was equally significant. The Roman people began to view Caesar not just as a great leader, but as a divine figure who had been murdered by impious men. Shrines to Caesar appeared throughout the city, while his supporters claimed that his spirit had been seen ascending to heaven. This deification of Caesar created a powerful symbol that his political heirs could use to legitimize their own claims to power. The psychological toll on the conspirators of seeing their noble act transformed into a crime was devastating. Men who had believed they were saving the Republic found themselves branded as traitors and murderers. Brutus, in particular, was haunted by the realization that he had destroyed not just Caesar, but his own reputation and the very cause he had tried to serve. The weight of unintended consequences would drive several of the conspirators to suicide in the years that followed. As you drift towards sleep tonight, Consider how the best intentions can lead to the worst outcomes when we fail to understand the full complexity of the forces we are trying to control. The conspirators who killed Caesar believed they were performing a noble act of liberation, but their failure to anticipate the emotional and political consequences of their actions led to results that were exactly opposite to what they intended. Their story reminds us that in politics, as in life, the road to disaster is often paved with good intentions, and that the most dangerous enemies of progress are sometimes those who claim to be its greatest champions. The civil wars that erupted in the wake of Caesar's assassination would rage for over a decade, ultimately destroying the very republic. The conspirators had died trying to save and giving birth to the Roman Empire under Augustus Caesar, a system of government that would endure for centuries and reshape the entire Western world. What began as a misguided attempt to restore traditional republican values ended with the establishment of an autocracy more complete and enduring than anything Caesar himself had ever envisioned. The immediate aftermath of Caesar's funeral saw Rome split into multiple factions, each claiming to represent the true interests of the Roman people. Mark Antony positioned himself as Caesar's political heir and the defender of his legacy, while the conspirators, led by Brutus and Cassius, fled to the eastern provinces where they began raising armies to fight for what they still believed was the cause of republican liberty. But the most significant development was the emergence of Caesar's 18-year-old grandnephew and adopted son, Gaius Octavius, who would later become known as Augustus. Octavian, as he was known before becoming Augustus, was initially dismissed by most observers as too young and inexperienced to play a significant role in the power struggle that was tearing Rome apart. But the young man possessed a political intelligence that belied his years, and he understood something that the other contenders for power had missed, that Caesar's name and legacy were more powerful than any army. By claiming to be Caesar's true heir and demanding vengeance for his murder, Octavian tapped into the popular anger that Antony had unleashed at the funeral. The formation of the Second Triumvirate in 43 BCE between Octavian, Mark Antony, and Marcus Lepidus marked the beginning of the end for the Roman Republic. This alliance was not a temporary emergency measure like the First Triumvirate of Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, but a formal division of the Roman world among three strongmen who had abandoned any pretense of republican government. Their first act was to publish proscription lists, death sentences for their political enemies that included not just the conspirators, but hundreds of senators and wealthy citizens whose property could be confiscated to fund their armies. The proscriptions that followed the formation of the triumvirate were more systematic and brutal than anything Rome had seen since the days of Sulla. The most famous victim was the great orator Cicero, whose head and hands were cut off and displayed in the Forum as a warning to anyone who opposed the new regime. Thousands of Romans were killed or forced into exile, while their property was seized to pay the soldiers who kept the triumvirs in power. The republic that the conspirators had died to save was being systematically dismantled by men who claimed to be avenging Caesar's murder. The Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE marked the final defeat of the republican cause and the death of its last champions. Brutus and Cassius, who had spent 2 years building armies in the east, were decisively defeated by the forces of Octavian and Antony. Both conspirators committed suicide rather than face capture. with Brutus reportedly saying that he was more disappointed in his friends who had abandoned him than in his enemies who had defeated him. Their deaths marked the end of any organized resistance to the new order that was emerging from the ashes of the Republic. The division of the Roman world between Octavian and Antony after Lepidus was sidelined created an unstable situation that could only be resolved through further conflict. Octavian took control of the West, including Italy and Gaul, while Antony ruled the wealthy eastern provinces. For nearly a decade, the two men maintained an uneasy alliance, but their fundamental differences in vision and ambition made eventual conflict inevitable. Antony's relationship with Cleopatra of Egypt provided Octavian with the perfect propaganda weapon to portray his rival as a traitor to Roman values. The Battle of Actium in 31 BCE was the final act in the drama that had begun with Caesar's assassination. Octavian's victory over Antony and Cleopatra eliminated the last obstacle to his complete control over the Roman world. The young man who had been dismissed as inexperienced and weak had outmaneuvered all his rivals and emerged as the sole master of an empire that stretched from Britain to Egypt. The Republic was dead, and in its place would rise an imperial system that would endure for over 4 centuries in the West and over 1,000 years in the East. The transformation of Octavian into Augustus Caesar in 27 BCE marked the formal beginning of the Roman Empire. Though the reality of imperial rule had existed for years, Augustus was careful to maintain the fiction that he was restoring the Republic rather than replacing it, keeping traditional institutions like the Senate while ensuring that real power remained in his hands. This careful balance between innovation and tradition allowed him to create a stable system of government that avoided the chaos and civil wars that had destroyed the Republic. The irony of the conspirators' failure was complete. Their attempt to prevent Caesar from becoming a king had instead led to the establishment of a system where one man held more power than any Roman king had ever possessed. Augustus and his successors would rule with an authority that was absolute in all but name, commanding armies, controlling finances, and shaping policy throughout the known world. The empire they created would survive barbarian invasions, economic crises, and internal rebellions that would have destroyed the old republic. The cultural and intellectual legacy of the transition from republic to empire was profound and lasting. The Augustan age saw a flowering of literature, art, and architecture that would influence Western civilization for millennia. Writers like Virgil, Horace, and Ovid created works that celebrated the new order while subtly acknowledging the costs of its creation. The peace and stability that Augustus brought to the Roman world allowed for unprecedented economic growth and cultural exchange. The legal and administrative innovations of the early empire provided models that would be copied throughout the Western world. The Roman legal system, refined and codified under imperial rule, became the foundation for legal systems throughout Europe. The administrative structures developed to govern the vast imperial territories influenced governmental organization for centuries. Even the concept of citizenship, expanded and regularized under the empire, provided precedents for modern ideas about rights and civic participation. The religious transformation that accompanied the rise of the empire was equally significant. The deification of Caesar and later emperors created a new form of ruler worship that would influence political thought throughout the ancient world. The imperial cult provided a unifying force that helped bind together the diverse peoples of the empire, while the religious tolerance that characterized much of imperial rule allowed for the spread of new faiths, including Christianity. The economic prosperity that the empire brought to the Mediterranean world was unprecedented in human history. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, created conditions for trade and commerce that allowed goods, ideas, and people to move freely across vast distances. Cities grew and prospered, new technologies were developed and spread, and living standards improved for millions of people. The economic integration achieved under imperial rule would not be matched again until the modern era. As we prepare to leave the blood-soaked battlefields where the Roman Republic died and the empire was born, remember that the greatest historical transformations often emerge from the unintended consequences of well-meaning actions. The senators who killed Caesar believed they were saving their republic, but their act of violence instead created the conditions for an even more autocratic system to emerge. Their failure reminds us that in politics, as in life, the most important outcomes are often those we never intended to create. From the chaos of Roman civil wars, our journey now takes us across the seas to the islands of Japan, where a very different kind of political transformation was taking place. Here we will encounter a man whose patience, cunning, and strategic vision would end centuries of warfare and create a peace that would last for over 200 years. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, consider how the destruction of one political system can give birth to another, and how the seeds of future greatness are often planted in the soil of present tragedy. From the chaotic aftermath of Caesar's assassination, where Roman ambitions tore apart a republic and gave birth to an empire, our journey through history now carries us across vast oceans to the islands of Japan, where a very different kind of political genius was quietly preparing to end centuries of warfare through patience, cunning, and an understanding of human nature that would make Machiavelli himself seem like an amateur. Here we encounter Tokugawa Ieyasu, a man whose childhood as a political hostage would forge him into one of history's most successful rulers and the architect of a peace that would endure for over 2.5 centuries. The Japan that shaped Tokugawa Ieyasu was a land torn apart by constant warfare, where powerful daimyo lords fought endless battles for territory, resources, and the ultimate prize, control over the entire archipelago. This was the Sengoku period, the age of warring states, when traditional authority had completely broken down and only military might determine political survival. Into this violent world was born a boy who would learn from childhood that survival required not just courage and strength, but also the ability to read people, anticipate their moves, and wait for the perfect moment to strike. Ieyasu's early life reads like a masterclass in how adversity can forge greatness, though the lessons came at a terrible personal cost. Born Matsudaira Takechiyo in 1543, he was the son of a minor daimyo whose small domain was caught between much more powerful neighbors. When Ieyasu was just 4 years old, his father was forced to send him as a hostage to the Imagawa clan to secure a military alliance. This wasn't an unusual arrangement in warring Japan, but for a young child, it meant being separated from his family and living under the constant threat that he could be killed if his father's loyalty ever wavered. The journey to his captivity became the first of many lessons in the brutal realities of political power. The ship carrying young Ieyasu to the Imagawa was intercepted by the rival Oda clan, who held him prisoner for 2 years before finally releasing him in a prisoner exchange. During this time, the boy learned that his life was nothing more than a bargaining chip in games played by adults whose ambitions mattered more than his welfare. This early experience of powerlessness would profoundly shape his later understanding of how to acquire and maintain real authority. When Ieyasu finally reached the Imagawa court at the age of 6, he entered a world that was both luxurious and dangerous. The Imagawa were one of Japan's most powerful clans, and their court was a center of culture and learning as well as military planning. But for a hostage child, every day was a reminder that his continued existence depended on forces completely beyond his control. He watched other hostage children disappear when their families fell from favor, and he learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when political winds were shifting. The education that Ieyasu received during his captivity was far more comprehensive than what most children of his era could expect. He studied classical Chinese literature, military strategy, economics, and statecraft under some of Japan's finest scholars. But perhaps more importantly, he learned by observing the complex political maneuvering that characterized life at a major daimyo court. He saw how alliances were formed and broken, how information was gathered and used, and how successful leaders balanced competing interests to maintain their power. The psychological impact of spending his formative years as a hostage cannot be overstated. While other children played games and formed friendships, Ieyasu learned to mask his emotions, to trust no one completely, and to always think several moves ahead. He developed an almost supernatural ability to remain calm under pressure and to wait patiently for opportunities that might not come for years or even decades. These skills, forged in the crucible of childhood captivity, would later prove essential to his success as a military commander and political leader. The death of Imagawa Yoshimoto in 1560, when Ieyasu was 17, suddenly freed him from his hostage status and thrust him into the dangerous world of independent daimyo leadership. The young man who returned to his family's domain was no longer the frightened child who had been sent away 13 years earlier. He had been transformed into a calculating political operator who understood that survival in warring Japan required not just military skill, but also the ability to form the right alliances at the right times. Ieyasu's first major political decision demonstrated the strategic thinking that would characterize his entire career. Rather than trying to maintain his family's traditional alliance with the now weakened Imagawa, he chose to ally himself with Oda Nobunaga, the rising power who had killed his former captor. This decision required him to set aside any personal feelings about the man who had disrupted his childhood and focus solely on what would best serve his long-term interests. It was a cold calculation that showed how completely his hostage years had shaped his approach to politics. The alliance with Nobunaga proved to be one of the most important relationships of Ieyasu's life. Though it was always characterized by careful mutual respect rather than genuine friendship, Nobunaga was a brilliant but unstable genius whose revolutionary military tactics and ruthless political methods were transforming Japanese warfare. Ieyasu learned enormously from observing Nobunaga's innovations, but he also noted his allies' weaknesses, particularly his tendency toward cruelty and his failure to build lasting institutional structures. The years of serving as Nobunaga's ally taught Ieyasu valuable lessons about both the possibilities and the limitations of military conquest. He participated in numerous campaigns that demonstrated how superior tactics and technology could overcome traditional advantages of numbers and position, but he also observed how Nobunaga's harsh methods created enemies who would eventually unite against him. Ieyasu began to develop his own vision of how Japan could be unified, not just through military force, but through a combination of strength and political wisdom that would create lasting stability. The assassination of Nobunaga in 1582 created a power vacuum that would test everything Ieyasu had learned during his years of careful observation and alliance building. While other daimyo rushed to claim Nobunaga's legacy through immediate military action, Ieyasu chose a more cautious approach. He understood that the man who moved too quickly might win initial victories, but ultimately exhaust himself fighting multiple enemies. Instead, he began the patient process of positioning himself for the long-term struggle that he knew was coming. The rise of Toyotomi Hideyoshi as Nobunaga's successor presented Ieyasu with perhaps his greatest challenge. Hideyoshi was a military genius who had risen from peasant origins to become one of Japan's most powerful leaders. He was also a charismatic leader who inspired fierce loyalty and seemed capable of achieving the dream of Japanese unification. For Ieyasu, the question was whether to challenge Hideyoshi immediately or to wait for a better opportunity. His decision to submit to Hideyoshi's authority while quietly building his own strength showed the patience and strategic thinking that would ultimately lead to his triumph. As you settle into sleep tonight, consider the extraordinary transformation of a frightened child hostage into one of history's most successful political leaders. Ieyasu's story reminds us that our greatest strengths often emerge from our deepest struggles, and that the ability to learn from adversity can be more valuable than any natural talent. His patient approach to power and his understanding that true victory requires not just winning battles, but building lasting institutions, would soon be tested in the crucible of Japanese politics. Tomorrow, we will see how the lessons learned in childhood captivity would guide him through the complex maneuvering that would make him the master of Japan. The years following Hideyoshi's rise to power revealed Tokugawa Ieyasu's greatest strength, his almost supernatural ability to wait for the perfect moment to act, even when that moment might be years or decades away. While other daimyo chafed under Hideyoshi's authority or plotted immediate rebellion, Ieyasu played a much more sophisticated game, building his power base methodically while appearing to be the most loyal of Hideyoshi's vassals. This strategy required a level of patience and self-control that few leaders in history have ever possessed. Ieyasu's submission to Hideyoshi in 1590 was a masterpiece of strategic thinking disguised as political defeat. When Hideyoshi demanded that Ieyasu give up his ancestral lands in Mikawa and accept new territories in the Kanto region around Edo, modern-day Tokyo, many observers saw this as a humiliation designed to weaken a potential rival. But Ieyasu recognized the hidden opportunity in what appeared to be a punishment. The Kanto was larger and potentially more prosperous than his old domain, and its distance from Hideyoshi's center of power would give him greater freedom to build his strength. The transformation of Edo from a small fishing village into a major city demonstrated Ieyasu's vision and administrative genius. While Hideyoshi was focused on grandiose military campaigns and magnificent palaces, Ieyasu was quietly building the infrastructure that would support long-term power. He drained swamps, built roads, encouraged trade, and attracted skilled craftsmen and merchants to his new capital. Within a few years, Edo had become one of Japan's most prosperous cities, generating the wealth that would fund Ieyasu's future ambitions. Ieyasu's approach to governing his new domain revealed his understanding that true power comes not from fear, but from creating conditions where people prosper under your rule. Unlike many daimyo who squeezed their territories for maximum short-term revenue, Ieyasu invested in long-term development. He reduced taxes to encourage economic growth, established fair legal systems that protected merchants and farmers, and created educational institutions that produced skilled administrators. His subjects didn't just obey him, they genuinely supported him because his rule made their lives better. The network of alliances that Ieyasu built during his years under Hideyoshi was perhaps his greatest political achievement. While maintaining the appearance of complete loyalty to his overlord, he quietly cultivated relationships with other daimyo who shared his concerns about Hideyoshi's increasingly erratic behavior. These weren't formal military alliances that could be detected by Hideyoshi's spies, but subtle understandings based on mutual respect and shared interests. When the time came to act, Ieyasu would have a ready-made coalition of supporters who trusted his judgment and leadership. Hideyoshi's disastrous invasions of Korea in the 1590s provided Ieyasu with the perfect opportunity to demonstrate his wisdom, while his rivals exhausted themselves in futile campaigns. While other daimyo were forced to commit their best troops and resources to Hideyoshi's Korean adventure, Ieyasu managed to minimize his participation while avoiding any appearance of disloyalty. He sent troops as required, but kept his most capable commanders and elite units at home, claiming they were needed to defend against potential threats to Japan itself. This careful balancing act allowed him to preserve his strength while his potential rivals bled themselves white in foreign wars. The psychological warfare that Ieyasu employed during this period was subtle but devastatingly effective. He cultivated an image of himself as the most reliable and trustworthy of Hideyoshi's vassals, the one leader who could be counted on to provide sound advice and steady support. This reputation made other daimyo more likely to confide in him and seek his counsel, giving him invaluable intelligence about their plans and capabilities. At the same time, his apparent loyalty made Hideyoshi less suspicious of his growing power and influence. The economic strategies that Ieyasu employed to build his wealth were far more sophisticated than the simple taxation and tribute systems used by most daimyo. He understood that encouraging trade and commerce would generate far more revenue than squeezing peasants for agricultural surplus. He established markets, built harbors, and created banking systems that attracted merchants from across Japan. His domain became a center of commercial activity that generated the resources needed to maintain large armies and fund extensive intelligence networks. Iyasu's approach to military preparation during this period showed his understanding that wars are won through logistics and planning, rather than just courage and tactics. While maintaining the appearance of a peaceful administrator, he was quietly building one of Japan's most formidable military machines. He recruited and trained elite units, stockpiled weapons and supplies, and developed detailed plans for rapid mobilization. His army looked smaller than those of his rivals, but it was better equipped, better trained, and better prepared for sustained campaigns. The intelligence network that Ieyasu developed was perhaps the most sophisticated in Japanese history. He recruited spies and informants from every level of society, from high-ranking samurai to humble merchants and servants. This network provided him with detailed information about his rivals' military capabilities, political plans, and personal weaknesses. More importantly, it allowed him to identify potential allies and enemies long before they revealed their true intentions. Knowledge, Ieyasu understood, was often more valuable than armies. The death of Hideyoshi in 1598 created the opportunity that Ieyasu had been patiently waiting for throughout his years of apparent submission. Hideyoshi's heir was a child, and the Regency Council established to govern in his name was divided by personal rivalries and conflicting ambitions. The unity that Hideyoshi had imposed through his personal charisma and military genius began to fracture almost immediately. For Ieyasu, this was the moment when decades of careful preparation would finally pay off. The political maneuvering that followed Hideyoshi's death revealed the full extent of Ieyasu's strategic genius. While other members of the Regency Council engaged in obvious power struggles and formed hasty alliances, Ieyasu appeared to remain above the fray. He positioned himself as the defender of Hideyoshi's legacy and the protector of the young heir. Even as he quietly activated the network of alliances he had spent years building, his rivals didn't realize they were being outmaneuvered until it was too late to stop him. The contrast between Ieyasu's patient, methodical approach and the impulsive actions of his rivals became increasingly apparent as the political crisis deepened. Leaders like Ishida Mitsunari, who had been among Hideyoshi's most trusted advisors, made the fatal error of moving too quickly and revealing their intentions too clearly. They formed obvious military coalitions and made inflammatory speeches that allowed Ieyasu to portray them as rebels against legitimate authority. By the time they realized they were walking into a trap, Ieyasu had already gained the moral and political high ground. The economic and logistical advantages that Ieyasu had built during his years of apparent submission now became decisive factors in the coming conflict. His domain was prosperous and well administered, capable of supporting extended military campaigns without imposing crushing burdens on the population. His rivals, many of whom had exhausted their resources in Hideyoshi's Korean campaigns, found themselves struggling to maintain their armies and fund their political activities. The patient investments Ieyasu had made in infrastructure and economic development were about to pay enormous dividends. As you drift towards sleep tonight, consider the extraordinary patience and strategic vision required to play such a long game. Ieyasu spent decades appearing to be subordinate to others while quietly building the foundation for his own supremacy. His story reminds us that true power often comes not to those who grab for it most aggressively, but to those who understand how to build lasting advantages and wait for the perfect moment to use them. Tomorrow we will see how all of his careful preparation would be tested in the crucible of battle, where a single day would determine the future of Japan. The Battle of Sekigahara on the 15th of October, 1600, would prove to be one of the most decisive military engagements in human history. A single day of fighting that ended centuries of warfare and established a political order that would endure for over 2.5 centuries. But what made this battle truly remarkable was not the fighting itself, which lasted only 6 hours, but the intricate web of political manipulation, strategic betrayal, and psychological warfare that Tokugawa Ieyasu had woven in the months leading up to the conflict. The political crisis that led to Sekigahara began when Ishida Mitsunari, one of Hideyoshi's most trusted administrators, made the fatal error of openly challenging Ieyasu's growing influence. Mitsunari was a brilliant bureaucrat and a man of unquestioned loyalty to Hideyoshi's memory, but he completely underestimated Ieyasu's political skills and the depth of support the Tokugawa leader had built over the years. When Mitsunari began forming a coalition to oppose Ieyasu, he thought he was organizing a defense of legitimate authority. In reality, he was walking into a trap that Ieyasu had been preparing for decades. The genius of Ieyasu's strategy lay in his ability to make his enemies appear to be the aggressors, while positioning himself as the defender of peace and legitimate order. When Mitsunari began raising armies and making inflammatory speeches about Ieyasu's ambitions, the Tokugawa leader responded with apparent reluctance and sorrow. He claimed that he had no desire for conflict, but was being forced to defend himself against unjust accusations. This masterful manipulation of public perception meant that when war finally came, many neutral daimyo saw Ieyasu as the wronged party rather than an ambitious usurper. The months leading up to Sekigahara saw Ieyasu deploy every weapon in his political arsenal to ensure victory before the battle even began. He used his vast intelligence network to identify which daimyo could be trusted, which could be bought, and which would need to be defeated. He made strategic marriages between his children and the heirs of important families, creating bonds of kinship that would be difficult to break. Most importantly, he used his reputation for honoring agreements and rewarding loyalty to convince wavering daimyo that their interests would be better served by supporting him rather than his enemies. The corruption of Mitsunari's coalition through Ieyasu's agents was a masterpiece of intelligence warfare. Key figures in the anti-Tokugawa alliance were secretly approached with offers of land, titles, and guarantees of safety for their families. Some were blackmailed with evidence of past misdeeds, while others were simply convinced that Ieyasu's victory was inevitable and that they should position themselves on the winning side. By the time the armies gathered at Sekigahara, several of Mitsunari's most important allies had already agreed to betray him at the crucial moment. The choice of Sekigahara as the battlefield was itself a stroke of strategic genius that demonstrated Ieyasu's understanding of both geography and psychology. The narrow valley forced both armies into a confined space where superior numbers would matter less than tactical skill and unit cohesion. More importantly, The location was symbolic, that sat astride the main road between eastern and western Japan, making it clear that the battle would determine who controlled the entire country. The psychological impact of fighting for such a strategically and symbolically important position would weigh heavily on the minds of both commanders and common soldiers. The deployment of forces on the morning of the 15th of October revealed the full extent of Ieyasu's political preparation. While Mitsunari's army appeared larger on paper, many of his units were commanded by men who had already secretly agreed to switch sides. Kobayakawa Hideaki, who controlled a crucial position on the heights overlooking the battlefield, had been promised rich rewards for his betrayal. Other commanders had received similar offers, creating a situation where Mitsunari was surrounded by enemies disguised as allies. The battle itself began with traditional samurai formalities, but quickly descended into a chaotic melee that would determine the fate of Japan. Ieyasu's forces attacked with the confidence of men who knew that victory was assured not just by their own courage, but by the treachery of their enemies. The Tokugawa troops fought with disciplined ferocity, knowing that their lord's careful planning had given them every possible advantage. On the other side, Mitsunari's loyal followers fought with desperate courage, gradually realizing that they had been betrayed by men they had trusted. The moment of decisive betrayal came when Kobayakawa Hideaki's forces, positioned on the heights where they could have devastated Ieyasu's army, instead turned their weapons on Mitsunari's troops. This treachery was followed by similar betrayals throughout the anti-Tokugawa coalition, as commander after commander revealed their true allegiances. What had begun as a battle between two armies became a massacre, as Mitsunari's forces found themselves attacked from all sides by men who had marched with them that morning. The psychological impact of these betrayals on the battlefield was devastating. Samurai who had prepared to die honorably for their cause instead found themselves abandoned by their allies and surrounded by enemies. The traditional codes of loyalty and honor that had governed Japanese warfare for centuries seemed to collapse in a single morning. Many of Mitsunari's followers committed suicide rather than face the shame of defeat through treachery, while others fled in confusion and despair. Mitsunari himself fought with the courage of a man who knew he was doomed but refused to surrender his principles. Even as his army disintegrated around him, he continued to rally his remaining loyal followers and launched desperate attacks against overwhelming odds. His personal bravery in the face of certain defeat earned him the respect even of his enemies, but it could not change the outcome of a battle that had been decided through political maneuvering rather than military skill. The capture and execution of Mitsunari after the battle marked the end of organized resistance to Tokugawa rule. Ieyasu treated his defeated enemy with a mixture of respect and ruthless practicality, acknowledging Mitsunari's loyalty to Hideyoshi while making it clear that such opposition would not be tolerated in the new order. The public display of Mitsunari's head served as a warning to any other daimyo who might consider challenging Tokugawa authority. The rewards and punishments that Ieyasu distributed after Sekigahara demonstrated his understanding that victory must be consolidated through careful political management. Those who had supported him were richly rewarded with new lands and titles, while those who had opposed him faced confiscation of their domains and, in many cases, death. But Ieyasu was also careful to show mercy to those who had fought against him, but could be useful in the future, demonstrating that loyalty to the new regime would be rewarded regardless of past allegiances. The speed with which opposition to Tokugawa rule collapsed after Sekigahara revealed the extent to which Ieyasu's victory had been predetermined by his political preparation. Daimyo throughout Japan quickly sent messages of submission and offers of service to the new hegemon. The country that had been torn apart by warfare for over a century suddenly found itself united under a single authority. The battle that had lasted only 6 hours had ended an era and begun a new chapter in Japanese history. The international implications of Ieyasu's victory were equally significant. Foreign traders and missionaries who had been dealing with a fragmented Japan suddenly found themselves facing a unified government with clear policies and consistent authority. The stability that Tokugawa rule brought to Japan would allow the country to control its interactions with the outside world in ways that had been impossible during the chaotic Sengoku period. As you settle into sleep tonight, consider how a single day of battle can reshape the destiny of an entire civilization. Sekigahara was not just a military victory, but the culmination of decades of patient political work that transformed Japan from a land of endless warfare into a unified nation. Ieyasu's triumph reminds us that the greatest victories are often won not on the battlefield, but in the careful preparation that makes battlefield success inevitable. Tomorrow, we will see how he used his victory to create institutions that would preserve peace for centuries to come. The establishment of the Tokugawa shogunate in 1603 marked not just the end of Japan's age of warfare, but the beginning of one of the most remarkable experiments in governance and social engineering that the world has ever seen. What Ieyasu created was not merely a military dictatorship built on the ashes of his enemies, but a sophisticated system of political, social, and economic control that would bring unprecedented peace and stability to Japan for over 2.5 centuries. The genius of the Tokugawa system lay in Ieyasu's understanding that lasting peace could not be maintained through military force alone, but required the creation of institutions and social structures that made warfare both impossible and unnecessary. He had observed how previous attempts at unification had failed because they relied too heavily on the personal charisma and military skill of individual leaders. The system he designed was built to outlast any single ruler and to function effectively even under weak or incompetent leadership. The Sankin Kotai system that Ieyasu established was perhaps the most brilliant example of turning potential threats into sources of strength. Under this arrangement, all daimyo were required to maintain residences in Edo and spend alternate years in the capital, while their wives and children remained there permanently as hostages. This system served multiple purposes. It prevented the daimyo from building up military forces in their home domains. It drained their financial resources through the enormous costs of maintaining dual households, and it created a unified aristocratic culture centered on the Tokugawa court. The economic transformation that accompanied the establishment of Tokugawa rule was equally revolutionary. Ieyasu understood that prosperity was the best guarantee of political stability, and he implemented policies that encouraged trade, agriculture, and craftsmanship while maintaining strict social order. The peace that his regime brought to Japan allowed for unprecedented economic growth, as merchants could travel safely between cities and farmers could invest in long-term improvements to their land without fear that their work would be destroyed by passing armies. The social hierarchy that the Tokugawa established was rigid but also remarkably stable. The four-class system of samurai, farmers, artisans, and merchants created clear roles and expectations for every member of society. While this system limited social mobility, it also provided security and predictability that had been impossible during the chaotic Sengoku period. People knew their place in society and what was expected of them, creating a sense of order and purpose that contributed to the regime's longevity. The cultural flowering that occurred under Tokugawa rule demonstrated how peace and stability could unleash human creativity and achievement. The arts, literature, and philosophy that emerged during the Edo period represented some of the highest achievements of Japanese civilization. Freed from the constant threat of warfare, people could devote their energies to pursuits that enriched the human spirit, rather than simply ensuring survival. The woodblock prints, kabuki theater, and haiku poetry that emerged during this period would influence world culture for centuries to come. The educational system that developed under Tokugawa rule was remarkably advanced for its time. The regime encouraged literacy and learning not just among the samurai class but throughout society. By the end of the Tokugawa period, Japan had one of the highest literacy rates in the world, an achievement that would prove crucial when the country was forced to modernize in the 19th century. The intellectual foundation that Tokugawa education provided enabled Japan to adapt to Western technology and ideas more quickly than any other Asian nation. The foreign policy that Ieyasu and his successors implemented was based on the principle of selective isolation that allowed Japan to control its interactions with the outside world. Rather than completely cutting off foreign contact, the Tokugawa carefully regulated trade and cultural exchange to prevent foreign influence from destabilizing their domestic order. This policy allowed Japan to benefit from foreign knowledge and technology while maintaining its political and cultural independence. The administrative innovations of the Tokugawa system created one of the most efficient governments in the pre-modern world. The bureaucracy that Ieyasu established was based on merit and competence rather than birth or personal connections. Officials were regularly rotated between different positions to prevent them from building independent power bases, while elaborate systems of checks and balances ensured that no single individual could accumulate too much authority. These administrative practices would later influence the development of modern Japanese government. The environmental policies of the Tokugawa regime were centuries ahead of their time. Faced with deforestation and resource depletion caused by centuries of warfare and rapid population growth, the government implemented comprehensive conservation programs that restored Japan's forests and established sustainable practices for resource use. These policies demonstrated an understanding of the relationship between environmental health and political stability that modern governments are still struggling to achieve. The legal system that developed under Tokugawa rule provided a level of justice and predictability that had been impossible during the Warring States period. Laws were clearly written and consistently enforced. creating an environment where people could plan for the future and invest in long-term projects. The emphasis on mediation and compromise rather than punishment helped to maintain social harmony and reduce the conflicts that had plagued earlier periods. The technological and scientific advances that occurred during the Tokugawa period were remarkable given Japan's relative isolation from the rest of the world. Japanese scholars and craftsmen made significant innovations in agriculture, manufacturing, and engineering that improved the quality of life for millions of people. The mathematical and astronomical knowledge that developed during this period rivaled that of any contemporary civilization. The legacy of Tokugawa Ieyasu extends far beyond the political system he created. His demonstration that lasting peace was possible through wise governance and institutional design provided a model that influenced political thinkers throughout the world. The prosperity and cultural achievement that flourished under his system proved that human societies could transcend the cycle of violence and conflict that had characterized so much of history. The end of the Tokugawa period in 1868 marked not the failure of Ieyasu's system, but its ultimate success. The peace and prosperity that his regime had created gave Japan the strength and unity needed to modernize rapidly and become a major world power. The institutions he had built provided the foundation for Japan's transformation into a modern nation, while the cultural achievements of the Edo period continued to influence Japanese identity and values. As our journey through these remarkable chapters of human history comes to its peaceful close, we find ourselves reflecting on the extraordinary range of human experience we have witnessed together. From the failed fathers of medieval Europe who destroyed their own children through cruelty and neglect, to the brilliant political assassination that transformed the Roman Republic into an empire, to the patient genius of Tokugawa Ieyasu, who ended centuries of warfare through wisdom and institutional design. Each story we have shared tonight has revealed different aspects of human nature and the eternal challenges of power, leadership, and the creation of lasting institutions. We have seen how personal failures can have consequences that echo through generations, how well-intentioned actions can produce results completely opposite to what was intended, and how patient wisdom and careful planning can achieve what force and ambition cannot. The thread that connects all these historical episodes is the recognition that human beings are capable of both extraordinary achievement and terrible failure, often simultaneously. The same species that produced cruel fathers who murdered their own children also created leaders who brought centuries of peace to entire civilizations. We are neither angels nor demons, but complex beings whose choices determine whether we create or destroy, heal or harm, build up or tear down. Tonight, as you drift into peaceful sleep in a world shaped by the lessons of history, remember that you too are part of this great continuing story of human civilization. The challenges we face today are not so different from those confronted by people throughout history, and the choices we make will determine what kind of world we leave for future generations. May your dreams be filled with the wisdom of those who came before us, and may you wake tomorrow with renewed appreciation for the precious gift of living in a time and place where peace and justice are possible. Sleep well, knowing that the greatest achievements in human history have come not from those who sought power for its own sake, but from those who understood that true leadership means creating institutions and systems that outlast any individual life. The legacy of Tokugawa Ieyasu reminds us that the most lasting victories are those that bring peace rather than conquest, prosperity rather than plunder, and hope rather than fear. Good night.